This is going to be a completely different kettle of fish. I was really impressed with the previous presentation. I have no experience of any practice at all. My paper is entirely theoretical. So I hope you'll bear with me. The question we'll think about today is whether we can plausibly align the intellectual currency of contemporary philosophy, especially deconstruction, with esoteric kabbalistic notions of language that is harbored in our rabbinic exegesis. My discussion centers on the notion of creation as an act of naming, sealing, and signing, and seeks to present the authorial signature as a moment of rupture in which kabbalistic notions of creation, the covenant of circumcision, and deconstructive theory might converge. As such, we'll move back and forth between the areas of medieval theosophy and current literary theory or philosophy. I'll focus on the sign and seal of the supreme being in the esoteric Semitic tradition, in the form of the initial letter in one of the many secret divine names. It is the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the Yud. Graphically, Yud is a minute sign. It looks like a suspended apostrophe, less than half the size of the other consonants. And yet, it holds the power to create entire universes and indeed to destroy them. Kabbalists will have it that all writing, every single creative act, turns on the secret powers of this small Yud, small sign. Now, while we might with relative ease translate the notion of creation from the sacred domain to the secular and correlate our notions of God, the creator of the universe, with human writers of text, in most other respects, certainly from my methodological perspective, in most other respects, the two are not compatible. And so before recklessly hazarding an alignment of two alien modes of thought and having no more than 20 minutes to defend my case, I should emphasize that the only possible line of approach is one that is suggestive rather than dogmatically affirmative. And so I'll proceed by way of a series of vignettes which do not so much attempt to lock the fluidities of both domains into rigidly consistent and hopelessly reductive argument, so much so as to focus on a series of perspectives as yet underrepresented in the relevant literature. And so accordingly, my method of presentation will be a mobile, sometimes elliptical, scanning of the landscape of my theme, inevitably involving a trajectory of overlay, backtracking, and repetition. But let me begin by telling you a story. It is the account of what happened before God's creation of the world, which we all know from Genesis, here in the Kabbalistic version. But first, a few words on Kabbalah, or the Kabbalah. Kabbalah, certainly classical Kabbalah, traditional Kabbalah, is an esoteric mode of rabbinic exegesis which emerged from the ancient Jewish traditions of quasi-mystical and prophetic speculation in the 2nd century of the Common Era, as a body of heterogeneous theosophical speculation that pursued knowledge of the divine, principally through meticulous and often radical scrutiny of the scriptural texts. This was dangerous work, investigating beyond normative exegesis into the domains of secret knowledge, and only the most learned of rabbis were permitted to engage in it. And so for centuries, the theosophists worked anonymously and committed very little to writing. It was not until the Middle Ages that this tradition began to crystallize into what came to be known as Kabbalah, or the Kabbalah. By the 12th century, Kabbalistic schools appeared in Europe, not least centered on the teachings of Yitzhak HaIver, Isaac the Blind, who died in 1235 in Provence, and Nachmanides, or Rambam, as he's often referred to, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, died in 1270 in Girona, and flourished until the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal in 1492. The Kabbalists then dispersed, and those who survived began to concern themselves increasingly with the idea of exile, the idea that exile must be a key component in creation from its very beginning. Diaspora, they thought, must have a special meaning, and this must be sought in the only manifestation of the Deus absconditus to which human beings have access, that is, the sacred texts, that is, Scripture. And this focus on exile, in which the existential and the textual go hand in hand, was to become prominent half a century later in the theories formed by a new school of Kabbalists who settled in Safed, in Tzfat, in Palestine, whose central figures were Moshe Cordovero, who died in 1570, and Yitzhak Luria, 1572. While resting largely on the ancient body of theosophical speculation, the story of creation that I'm about to tell you emerged out of this climate of dispersal and uprootedness. As Gershom Scholem, the primary scholar of Jewish esoteric thought in modern times, as Scholem points out, life was conceived now in the 16th century as existence in exile and in self-contradiction, and the sufferings of exile were linked with the central Kabbalistic doctrines about God and man, unquote. In the modern secular world, as we know, there are many Kabbalistic systems in practice. The tree of life, as we've heard about today, can be used to map all manner of things that I know very little about. But there are a lot of these modern usages of this medieval mode of thought to which only few really have access. Classical Kabbalah is a theosophy, a mode of rabbinic exegesis, which focuses on the secret aspect of the divine that can then be used to map out in all sorts of ways, which I'm also going to do here. The story I'm going to tell you is this. One day, the infinite God, the Ein Sof, it literally means without end. The Ein Sof was in a creative mood, and in order to clear space in which to play, Ein Sof held its breath, thus vacating a domain within its own infinite being. And now, faced with a finite blank space, the Ein Sof did what most of us do when sitting before a clean sheet of paper or a white canvas. Ein Sof wrote its name, or rather signed its initials in 4 flaming letters in this primordial void. We all know the Tetragrammaton, transliterated from the Hebrew Yud Vav He Vav into the Roman YHVH. And as the first of these letters, which is also the smallest, it is that minute Yud, when that first of letters entered the void, the entire alphabet emerged. The signs came together in a particular constellation and formed the first vessel, Adam Kadmon, first blood, first earth, or first Adam. And this was a fine, entirely flawless creation, so much so, in fact, that it couldn't hold its own perfection. It burst, shattered into pieces, and fell. But then, again in the story, the letters of the alphabet worked their fire magic again and welded the fragments together to form another vessel, imperfect this time, for it was chipped, much like a cracked piece of porcelain we've glued back together again, and which never regain its fine, distinctive ring. And this, the second vessel, is where creation, as we know it from Genesis, began. The chaotic abyss, windswept, without form or void, according to this ancient story. And of course, those of you who are interested in Gnostic cosmogony from the early centuries before the Common Era will find similar our notions of the created world as an imperfect one. Hermes Trismegistus has been mentioned today, the Mandaean sect of Iraq, the school of Mani, Qumran, and Hans Jonas's little book entitled The Gnostic Religion from 1958 is really very helpful here. But according to medieval kabbalistic cosmogony, the universe is the product of this divine signature or secret name, or an exercise, if you will, in creative writing. A failed attempt at self-representation, inherently broken, indeed turning on its innate fracture. Hence the flaw in our world, as reflected ultimately in language and writing. Now, of course, my account here is highly reductive and will in no way do justice to the profoundly complex and elaborate theosophical speculation of the Kabbalistic sages, Yitzhak Haiver, Yitzhak Luria, Moshe Cordovero, and many others. Moreover, it's taken entirely out of its context as a tripartite dialectical process of divine manifestation. But the point I wish to make is that in this body of thought, creation was first linguistic. It's all about language here. The alphabet, as Gershom Scholem points out, the alphabet is the original source of language, he argues, and at the same time, the original source of being. Now, the Spanish Kabbalists from the Middle Ages, they regarded all reading and writing in the world as a repetition of this process I've just delineated in the story I told. A repetition of this process of creation, and they argued that everything brought into being reflects the creative language of the Ein Sof as iteration or variation of the divine signature. And so from this perspective, every time we write, we rehearse the divine secret name and signature. Strange as it may sound, this is also what happens at a circumcision, certainly a Jewish circumcision. Traditionally, the severing of the foreskin from the glands in this ritual is seen as symbolically reenacting our creation by the inscription of the sign of the infinite Ein Sof in the body of the male infant. The correlation between circumcision and the divine initial dates back to the Aramaic sources of the 2nd century before the Common Era, and is widespread in rabbinic literature. In Midrash Tanchuma, for instance, we find the morphological relation between the divine initial, this little rounded yud, and the preputial kat. The yud is the letter of the Holy Covenant, as Nathaniel Hayachi argued, circumcision is made like a yud. So attempts to endow this minute sign with symbolic value are vast and varied. In very general terms, however, Yud is seen as the origin of creation, as I've just explained. Creation, then, is a linguistic process which at once forms a vessel and splinters it. And this double movement is symbolically reenacted in the ritual of circumcision, itself a bipartite act of cutting to an alliance between God and Abraham by the cutting off of the foreskin, sealed in the preputial incision, morphologically identified with the shape of the divine sign. So you can make everything fit together here. As Elliot Wolfson argues, he says, and I quote, "The rite of circumcision legitimately functions as the everlasting covenant between God and the Jew, because the seal of circumcision, which is at the same time the seal by means of which God created heaven and earth, is the most sacred of God's names. Circumcision is therefore the inscription of the divine letter, and hence the divine name upon the flesh of the Jew." Unquote. And so we have scission and seal in one swift stroke of the pen or the knife. The question is whether we can possibly translate these theosophical and ritualistic images into the intellectual idiom of 20th or 21st century theory, which, of course, situates itself outside metaphysical models of thought. And I would argue that we can. We've seen that yesterday and today. But in this case, a necessary condition of proposing such a relation is to strip these notions of their religious aspects, I would argue, and look at them simply as tropes, and by extension, connecting them with the imagery of severance, which accompanies much post-structuralist deconstructive theory in general. If by further extension we relate it to what the philosopher Jacques Derrida said about a whole range of issues, such as the split sign, the preliminary blank, the two-edged sword of the signature, the double movement of naming, etc., we can begin to see circumcision as a figure for the practice of deconstruction itself. I've argued this at much greater length elsewhere. But while Derrida always consistently disavowed any affiliation with Jewish thought, the figure of circumcision as a wound, a cut, or a double cut always accompanied his thinking, sometimes lurking in the corners of his many books, sometimes explicitly discussed. And for instance, in Circumfession from 1991, he rather astonishingly declares, circumcision, that's all I've ever talked about, he says. And later, in Archive Fever from 1995, he speaks of the, and I quote, the immemorial archive called circumcision. These statements are not frivolously made, for the figure of circumcision is closely, or can be closely associated with deconstructive notions of writing as an act in which something is expressed, something is made to appear, said, written, or created, if you will, and in the same moment effaced. So as such, the moment we say or write something, its significance is disseminated or lost. We cannot be sure, for instance, how or indeed whether our intended meaning reaches its destination. In other words, speaking or writing means opening the word to the other, to interpretation, or as Derrida puts it, to the counter signature of the reader. I'm going to skip to my ending here. So for Derrida, circumcision prompts the simultaneous appearance and effacement of everything that calls itself, that is, everything that names itself, which is what words do. It is also what the infinite Ein Sof did in the esoteric kabbalistic version of cosmogony. According to Derrida, all writing is subjected to preliminary division. There must be circumcision, he said, and shibboleth, for language to be readable, and by readable here he means open or open to and by the other. I quote here, the circumcised word is first of all written at once both incised and excised in the body, which may be the body of language, the word which is entered into, wounded, in order to be what it is, the poem caesura, the word cut into, Derrida and Shibboleth. And this, in a somewhat elliptical and highly sketchy manner, brings us full circle back to my starting point in this address, I hope, from the double movement of formation and breakage in kabbalistic cosmogony to the reenactment of the divine creative signature in the Semitic ritual of circumcision, finally to the contemporary theoretical notion of language as self-deconstruction, that is, by analogy.